Emma had always loved hiking in the mountains, so when she was invited to her friend Lily's family cabin deep in the forest, she jumped at the chance. The cabin was old but well kept, nestled in a valley where cell service was spotty, and the nearest town was an hour away. Lily and her family had warned her about the strange stories from the area, mostly local folklore about the hollow ones, figures that people claimed to see in the forest at night. Some believed they were spirits of the forest, others said they were echoes of travelers who had lost their way, forever trapped. But Emma, a city girl through and through, didn't buy into ghost stories. The first night at the cabin, as Emma and Lily sat around a fire outside, Lily's father casually warned them not to go too far after dark. "The forest isn't safe at night," he said, a strange look in his eyes. "If you hear anyone calling your name, no matter how familiar it sounds, ignore it, and whatever you do, don't answer it." Emma scoffed, laughing it off as an attempt to spook her. But Lily seemed tense, almost fearful, as if her father's warning wasn't just some rural ghost story. That night, as she lay in bed, Emma found herself wide awake. The forest outside was deathly silent, too silent for comfort. She closed her eyes, trying to fall asleep. But then she heard something, a faint rustling like footsteps outside her window. She sat up, heart pounding. Listening intently, she convinced herself it was just an animal. Suddenly, she heard a voice outside whispering, "Emma, Emma." It sounded exactly like Lily. She froze, her blood running cold. The voice called her name again, closer this time, in that same familiar tone. She wanted to believe it was her friend, maybe playing a prank, but something in the voice sounded wrong. It was too flat, too emotionless. Emma got up and crept to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. Her heart nearly stopped at what she saw. Just at the edge of the tree line stood a figure that looked exactly like Lily. But her face was blank, devoid of expression, and her eyes were empty, black pits. The figure raised a hand, beckoning her forward, still calling her name in that same hollow voice. Emma stumbled back, her heart racing. She heard the door creak, and to her horror, the voice echoed through the cabin, as if it were right outside her room. "Emma, come outside." Terrified, Emma locked her door and pressed her back against it. The voice continued, repeating her name, as if trying to wear down her will. She squeezed her eyes shut, reciting in her head that it couldn't be Lily. It was something else, something pretending to be her friend. The voice grew softer, almost coaxing. "Please, Emma, don't leave me out here alone." Emma's resolve began to waver. It sounded just like Lily, desperate and afraid. What if her friend was in trouble? Just as she reached for the door, she heard footsteps in the hallway. She stopped, hand on the knob, as the sound grew closer. Then she heard Lily's voice again, only this time it was coming from outside the window, while the footsteps inside the cabin stopped right outside her door. Slowly, Emma knelt by the window and peeked out. Standing in the clearing was another version of Lily, staring up at her, mouth slightly open, eyes dark and empty. And behind this version of Lily, dozens of figures began to emerge from the forest. Some were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, some in more modern attire, all wearing the same hollow, blank expressions. Their eyes were empty, black as night, and each one stood silently watching her window. Emma backed away, her breaths coming in short gasps. Suddenly, there was a soft knock on her door, and another version of Lily's voice whispered, "Emma, it's cold out here. Let me in." A chill ran down her spine as she realized something horrifying. Every figure outside had the same dead-eyed expression, but each face bore the distinct likeness of a different person. There was another knock on the door, this time louder. She could hear the lock jiggle as if someone were trying to get in. Desperate, she grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Trapped and terrified, she crept to the far corner of the room, trying to stay silent. The knocking stopped, and for a brief moment, everything was deathly still. Then, from just outside her door, she heard a faint scratching sound. It grew louder, insistent, like nails dragging along the wood. Emma shut her eyes tight, praying it would stop. But then she heard them, the voices. Dozens of them, whispering her name, layering over one another in a chilling, discordant harmony. Finally, the voices faded and she dared to open her eyes. The cabin was silent once again. Summoning every ounce of courage, she waited a few more minutes, then crept to the door, cracked it open, and peered down the hallway. Empty. Heart pounding, she tiptoed through the cabin, careful not to make a sound, and finally reached Lily's room. She found Lily huddled in the corner, looking as terrified as she felt. Lily whispered, "You saw them too, didn't you?" Emma could only nod, too shaken to speak. They spent the rest of the night sitting back to back, listening to the faint scratching and murmurs outside until dawn broke. When morning finally arrived, Emma and Lily left the cabin, their faces pale and exhausted. As they walked past the edge of the forest, Emma glanced back and froze. Just barely visible between the trees, she saw her own face staring back at her, black-eyed and expressionless, its mouth curled into a thin, knowing smile. They never spoke about that night again, but Emma knew, deep down, that the Hollow Ones were still out there, waiting, watching, and